It's very striking, as we see precisely in the gospel today, just how much of Jesus' ministry consisted in healing. Time and time again that happens. In fact, we could say that that's the centerpiece, the purpose of his ministry. I mean, that's what Jesus himself said. Remember the story at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, when he began his mission, went to Nazareth. It was the inauguration of his ministry, and he was given the scroll of Isaiah, and he opened it to Isaiah 61. It said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives and sight to the blind, and proclaim a year of favor for the Lord." So, his own sense of his own being anointed by God as the Christ was bringing healing, bringing liberty, bringing sight. Or to take the first reading that we have today, Isaiah 35. Jesus seems to refer to this passage, which we use during Advent, by the way, preparing for the coming of the Anointed One. Isaiah 35, when John's disciples come to him, when John's been put in prison, Matthew's Gospel, and John's a little puzzled. He was preaching and expecting fire and brimstone from God, great prophet that he was, and instead, Jesus is going around healing people. So Jesus says, well, blessed is the one who doesn't take scandal in me, but go tell John what you see and hear. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. As if correcting even John himself by telling him, look, this is what my ministry is about healing. So we should take that very seriously. But even though, the physical healings were so important, and I can only imagine what it's like to be, for example, deaf or blind, mute, in that sense. Luckily, thank God, modern science has made great progress in so many cases. But still, I think it's safe to say that for all their beauty and worth, it was also, maybe even primarily meant to be a symbol of the deeper healing which all of us need in order to really see and really hear. Because most of us think, oh, I see, I hear. Whereas Jesus is constantly saying, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear, because it's not obvious that you will. We have to really open our eyes. As my friend Richard Rohr says very well, people don't see things as they are, they see things as they are. We're projecting all sorts of limitations and filters and stuff according to our own conditioning, and we don't really see what's really there. And the spiritual aspect of Jesus' healing was clear from John chapter 9, which we used during Lent. That long, beautiful chapter about the healing of the man born blind. At the very end, the Pharisees say to him, oh, so are you saying we're blind? And Jesus says, well, if you were simply blind, you would have no sin. Interesting. In other words, we're all blind. And that's just the way we start, so okay. But, he adds, because you say, oh, we see, your guilt remains. Very challenging for us, because to the extent that we go around saying, we see, we understand, we see clearly, our guilt remains too. So what aren't we seeing? Well, for example, the second reading today, this continuous reading that we've been following in the letter of James, gives us a good example of what we might not be seeing. Very contemporary example, if a rich person comes into your assembly, with jewelry and fine clothes, you say, oh, come right in, sit right here. Maybe we'll get a good donation out of them. And then some poor person comes in, some homeless person off the street in shabby clothes, and you say, oh, we'll stand in the back and stay, at my footstool. Are we not discriminating? Are we not judging, as James said? Are we not seeing who's there? Jesus himself identifies, lest we make any mistake about it, with the poor and the rejected. The very parable he says that we'll be judged on. Oh, Jesus, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not minister to you? When did we not see you? And Jesus will say, well, you didn't see the very least of my brethren who were hungry and thirsty and stranger and in prison and sick and naked. We can at least say that Germany gave good example today, opening its gates to the migrant, to the stranger. Wish we took a page from them in our own country. But this is the very thing that's important. To recognize Jesus in the poor, the neglected, the despised. One of my spiritual directees, a woman came to me some time ago and said, on my way here, on the subway, I was sitting across from a homeless person. And I was suddenly filled with a sense of God's presence. She saw, she woke up. There was Christ. Whereas most of us would go to the next car, especially if the person hadn't bathed in a couple of days. We're running away from Christ. We're not seeing what's there. The stone rejected by the builders has become the cornerstone, as Jesus says of himself, quoting Psalm 118, which we use every Sunday, and on Easter particularly. The stone rejected is the cornerstone. The person, or the parts of ourselves for that matter, that we most reject, become the cornerstone of God's temple. Jesus himself was an example, an executed criminal who became the cornerstone of God's kingdom. And what about that text we recite every Good Friday? Isaiah 53, the servant's song. There was no beauty to make us look at him, no comeliness that we should glance at him. He was despised and rejected. Someone that people turn their face away from. Exactly. We've turned that into such a pious, familiar phrase or vision that we don't realize that that's the way God works all the time. That it's the despised and the rejected from which we turn away our face, and nothing that attracts our attention, both in other people and in ourselves, that becomes the cornerstone of God's construction. Wow. So it's not just that we're not seeing people as they really are, or as Thomas Merton says, people walk around not realizing that they're shining like the sun. As Jesus says about the kingdom, that they will shine like the sun in the kingdom of my Father. We have that within us. But we're not seeing it in ourselves either. We don't see ourselves as we really are and what God is really doing. You know, this spiritual aspect comes through a little bit also in the psalm today when it says he raises up the brokenhearted, raises up those who are bowed down. The translation is that we just sang. In Latin, the word is depressos. He raises up the depressed. Very contemporary. Whatever the physical aspect of that may be, there's a psycho-spiritual component, is there not, to depression. It might, you could even phrase it in these terms. Because we don't see ourselves as we really are in God's eyes, shining like the sun, or the world around us, ablaze with God's presence, especially in the most neglected. Of course we're going to get depressed. How not? So that's what we have to be cured of. Or the word that's used for the mute, it says the impediment of his speech was cured. The bond, literally, the bond of his tongue was loosed. In Hebrew, that's what the word mute, the root of it is. We're bound. And we can't speak words of joy and compassion and hope because we're bound, tied up. The Lord frees those who are bound up, is what the psalm also says. Bound up with our own fears and our own doubts, and our own complexes and compulsions and addictions. This is the work of healing. But the kicker is that we go down into that very stuff Not just burrowing our way through to get down into the gold or the diamond or the shining gem, which is there, but that very stuff, the rejected, despised parts, are what become the jewel. Both psychiatry and mysticism across the ages have reminded us of this, the spiritual alchemy, transformation of the lead into gold, the gold that we are, and we still don't get it. And Jesus showed us the way in the gospel. Did you catch how he doesn't just stand spiritually aloof and cures him? He gets down and dirty, puts his finger into his ears and spits and touches his tongue and groans and says, Ephphatha. No doubt an exact word that he did use in Aramaic for be opened. So he gets down into our cave, into our gut as well, and says, be opened. It's right there with us. He's right there. That despised part of ourselves is the despised and rejected, suffering servant, Christ himself. So it's not that we love the sinner or hate the sin, that horrible statement. Not even that we love the sinner and hate our own sin. We don't hate anything. God doesn't hate anything. He takes all of us and every bit of us as we are and forgives it, embraces it, holds it, caresses it, transforms it, harmonizes it, makes it part of the kingdom of God. That's the magnificence of it. That's what's so encouraging. It all becomes part of the kingdom. So let us allow that to happen in us. Because in the end, as we're transformed into Christ, into this killed and resurrected new Adam, it's Christ who lives in us. In the end, it's only Christ who sees only Christ everywhere. That's what it means to wake up and see. And until we get that, we're, to use the other parable, sitting by the roadside begging, Son of David, have mercy on me, that I may see. Because until we really see that way, only Christ, seeing only Christ, everywhere and in everyone, including ourselves, we're still blind.